Okay, let's talk about chapter 11 from this textbook, Public Speaking for College and Career, Introductions and Conclusions. This is the topic of the chapter. Let's jump into it. First and foremost, your opening and closing is one of the most important parts of your speech. Hopefully before now you've watched the body building video on how to build out the body of your speech, but the opening and closing are like a nice sandwich. It's like the bread on a sandwich. It just is a nice finish. We have a picture of a lawyer right here because when it comes to defense and prosecuting attorneys, their opening and closing statements literally can be the reason why their client wins or loses a case. So the opening and closing are super important for you to finesse and get right with your speech. The purpose of your introduction is to gain attention and interest in your audience members. You can do this by relating a story, so giving a real life story that you've experienced or a hypothetical story. So you could say, I want you to imagine that you're an individual in a public speaking course who has to give a speech. What are you feeling, right? And maybe your whole speech is about nervousness, but the attention getter is super important because you're doing exactly what it's called. You're grabbing the attention of the audience members. So one form of an attention getter is creating a story, whether it's real life or hypothetical. You can also ask a question to your audience members. It can be a rhetorical question where you don't expect them to answer or an overt response. Ultimately, I say, do what feels right. I personally am not a fan of questions at the beginning of a speech, but sometimes they can be done really well. So for example, there was a really famous TED Talk that just went viral a few months ago. I think it got like 4 million views within 3 days. And his opening line was, do you care about the children of America? Well, obviously everyone's like, yeah, I care about the children of America. And he went on to talk about essentially the education system, economics, and his whole point was to essentially say that if we care about the children of America, we should be caring about these industries and sectors of the world and topics because they're in crisis right now. And if we don't do something about them, we're doing a disservice to our children of America. Really powerful stuff. So a question can be powerful, but make sure that it's a good question. You don't want to say something that everybody's done. Like, for example, have you ever woken up in the morning? I'm like, no, duh, right? So really put some thought into your attention getter, especially if it's going to be a question. This is an example of a question that you can ask. So who can best predict a breakup? These types of questions can often lead into a statistic, such as like, you might ask your audience members, who can best predict a breakup? The couple, his friends, or her friends. And you can say, scientists have found that it's actually C, her friends, but in actuality, it's actually blah, blah, blah. So you can use these questions to help lead into statistics. You can get really creative with attention getters, but this is one way that you can do that. You can make a provocative statement, such as Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player of all time. Obviously, this is going to stir up some controversy because some people believe LeBron James is the greatest basketball player of all time, or, but this is a very provocative and definitive statement that'll draw people's attention into your conversation. Note at this point, all of these attention getters probably have something to do with the body of the speech, right? So with this provocative statement, Michael Jordan is the greatest basketball player of all time, I'm expecting us to talk something about sports or basketball or athletes, something in that realm. It'd be really odd if we talked about finances and or global warming and why we should care about global warming when this is the opening statement. So your attention getter needs to relate to your overall speech. You can cite a quote. This is one from Thomas Jefferson. Quotes can really draw your audience members in. You can arouse curiosity by warning signs or even pictures or visual aids. And you also need to give an incentive to listen. So for example, if you just adopted a puppy and you went to a free class led by the adoption center, they may say, this whole speech is about vaccines, right? So it's an incentive to me to lean in and listen, because they know I just bought a dog and I need to get them vaccinated from the adoption center or whatever it might be. An incentive to also listen might be like what your audience members are going to get out of your speech. That's another way that you can gain their attention. So going back to attention getters, a couple of key factors that aren't included in these slide decks is, one, you can also use jokes. I will say that if you are not a funny person and you don't typically do jokes, I wouldn't recommend opening your speech with a joke. Timing is really important when it comes to that, to giving jokes. I know for a fact I'm not a funny person when it comes to landing jokes. I'm more of a goofy person and I like telling stories. So that's how I tend to open up my speeches. And I like relating to the audience members always, obviously. But jokes can be a way to open the speech. Another way, and this is got to kind of be really, again, this is a timing thing, doing an expectancy violation. So going back to the Michael Jordan speech, right? I might say a definitive statement such as that, but it would be weird if I talked about global warming, right? However, if I gave an attention getter and I said, and I started off with the question of like, how many of you know how to play poker? And half the class raised their hand. I'm like, that's great, because that doesn't matter. We're actually talking about something completely different, right? It kind of ties into a joke, but you're violating your audience members' expectations of what they're about to hear. And it draws them in because they're like, whoa, like, I thought we were going to talk about poker and we're not. So like, what are we going to talk about? Humans want to hear things that violate their expectations. They lean in. You'll notice when you watch TikTok videos, people do this all the time. They grab your attention, and these are the videos that we spend 5-10 minutes watching. So your attention getter really matters. In your introduction, you're also orienting the audience members to what you're going to talk about. So you're going to give some background information on not only the concept, a little bit of it. You don't want to give away the body of your paragraph, right? You just want to give a background on it. So for example, if I was giving a speech on minimum wage, I might give some minimal background information about minimum wage started back in 1607, and now we're still dealing with minimum wage all the way up until 2024. So that's just some general background information without giving away the main points. But you also need to establish your credibility of the speech. So why are you credible to be speaking on this topic? For example, I gave a TED Talk on why you should develop empathy. And I gave 3 kind of like main reasons why I'm credible. And it was because I've taught on empathy before, I've done a lot of research on it, but more importantly, I had a traumatic event in my life that required me to develop a lot of empathy to overcome feelings of loneliness and depression at a very young age. And so I established my credibility early on for why I was able to speak on that topic. Similarly, you might establish your credibility by saying, I've put in weeks of time to create this presentation, or I have 10 plus years as a Nicki Minaj fan, so that's why I'm credible to be speaking on Nicki Minaj. Just establish your credibility for your audience members. You also need to preview the body of the speech. So just talk about your central idea and give a preview of the main points without going into the main details or the supporting data that supports your main points. Some guidelines to follow when creating your introductions and presenting them. Don't prepare the introductions first. Always remember to prepare your body of your paragraph first and then your introduction. You don't want to be too brief with your introduction. So you don't want it to be 30 seconds. Your intro could potentially be anywhere from a minute and a half to 2 minutes. Have an obvious tie-in to your body section. So this is AKA another transition. So make sure that the transition from your intro to the body of your presentation is succinct. And then never apologize at the beginning of your speech. Remember, people don't know what they don't know. So they can't tell if you're nervous. They don't know if you've never prepared or if you prepared last minute. So never say something along the lines of, I'm so sorry, I threw this together last minute. To them, it might be the greatest speech that they've ever seen. So never apologize at the beginning of your speech. Moving into conclusions, which is the latter half of the development of a speech. There are a couple of ways that you can signal the end of a speech. One, verbally, and two, non-verbally. They coalesce together, and so let's dive a little bit deeper into what that looks like. So verbally, you would summarize the key ideas. So you might say, from this speech, you now know how to make a sandwich, serve a sandwich, and dispose of a sandwich. And the whole point of your speech was how to make a sandwich, right? Or like how to be a great host with using sandwiches. So you're just finalizing and reminding the listeners that these were the main concepts that they heard throughout the speech. People's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And so people's attention spans, they get peaked. You peak their attention with the attention getter, they go down, they peak again. Maybe you said something that they really like, they go down, but they aren't completely flat across the way. People get distracted. Maybe they got a text message. So it's really important that you summarize the key ideas so that you can remind them of what maybe something that they missed and what you talked about. And then finally, in the conclusions, you're reinforcing the central idea with a clincher. What is a clincher? You can have a clincher such as citing a quote. So you might say, you know, if all else fails, just always remember what Thomas Edison said. I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. Thank you for your time, right? Like that's a solid clincher ending to a speech. You can issue an appeal or a challenge. This is really important for your persuasive speeches. You always, 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 always have to have a call to action with your persuasive speeches. That's the definitive feature of a persuasive speech versus an informative speech. So informative speeches, you're just informing the audience members. You're not trying to persuade them to do anything. Whereas with persuasive speech, you want people to take action, right? So for example, if I was giving a speech on why you should donate to ASPCA, the animal, an animal health, ASPCA is, they basically help animals, but essentially at the end, I might say, you can help these animals if you donate $5 today. Please scan the QR code located behind me to donate now, right? So that's a clear call to action of what I want you to do after my speech. So you want to issue an appeal or a challenge to your audience members. Another clincher is you can give an illustration. So imagine I was giving a speech on why you shouldn't text and drive. And what made me credible was, let's say I've lost both my legs because I was texting and driving and I got in a car accident. I might post a picture or an illustration and say like, don't let this be you, right? Like, don't let this be your vehicle. And so you can give an illustration as a clincher. Another way to conclude via clincher is by providing a kind of like referencing your introduction again. So you can reference whatever attention getter you mentioned at the beginning. So for example, let's say you gave a question out, said you may be interested on like who's more likely to break up with an individual after 5 years. Is it the woman or the man, right? State you at the beginning, you give a question, but an incentive of like, keep listening because by the end, we're going to give that answer. And then in the conclusion, your clincher is that you give the answer to the introduction. Some guidelines for conclusions is you don't want to drag out the ending. You don't want to talk forever. We've all seen these speeches where it's like, okay, we know this is wrapped up, but you've been talking for the last 15 minutes. No, when it's done, it's done. Don't end weakly. Have a strong conclusion. Make sure that you use one of those clinchers and make sure that you also say thank you. Like I said, you can give verbal indications that you're done, but you can also give nonverbal indications. Some people may put their hands up and say like, thank you, or like, thank you, right? Goodbye. These are nonverbal indications that we're done with the speech. Don't end apologetically. Just like at the beginning, you don't want to apologize for maybe putting together the speech last minute. Similarly, let's say you give the speech and you fumble in the middle. You don't want to at the end, you don't want to say, I'm so sorry for messing up. Thank you all for your time. I mean, it's awkward. Don't end apologetically. And then finally, never bring in a new point. So don't introduce something that the audience members have never heard of before. So for example, let's say my speech is all about birds, and I talk about how birds eat, and I talk about when birds fly south for the winter. It would be really odd for me at the end of my speech to say, did you know, like, start talking about the different colors of the bird's feathers? That's totally off kilter from what I'm expecting as an audience member. Something really important when it comes to the structure of your speech, think of it as like you're literally telling a story. So we'll use a nursery rhyme such as Goldilocks and the Three Bears. If you aren't familiar with it, Goldilocks goes into a bear's house. The bears are out of the house, and she tries their porridge. One's too hot, one's too cold, one's just right, and she takes a sleep in their bed, but the bears come back. Anyways, that story has a chronological order. And when we read stories or we open up a new book, we have expectations of how the story is going to flow. And so it's not good to bring in a new point at the end or something that's unexpected. Finally, as usual, I end with a tip for your career before concluding this video. Using my tip for intros and conclusions for presentations with your career is to use an icebreaker to start off a community speech. I wouldn't recommend this for a, TED Talk or for a speech in class, but when you're at a career fair, you may introduce yourself a little bit more. You may start off with an icebreaker of like, thank you for allowing me to come speak with you all here today. I'm really excited to talk about this. You don't need to do that when you are opening your speech for this course, but when it comes to your career or community speech, you want to start off with some type of like, thank you for allowing me to come speak today. With that being said, I hope you feel a little bit more confident with creating your introductions and your conclusions for your outlines and for your speeches. Have a great rest of your day, and please email me if you have any questions. Bye.